A child encounters a problem in his or her life, and they just happen to have an engineer in their life that says, engineers solve problems, and here's how we do it. And so we can get a lot of the background information, a lot of the context, and a lot of the first look at engineering through these storybooks. So the Imagine time in EIE, like I'm sure most of your project, is a really pretty crazy time. We go through pretty rapid cycles of brainstorming, quick prototyping, coming back, brainstorming, prototyping, bringing the teachers in, going back, and then at some point when we feel like it has a prayer standing on its legs, it will go out for classroom testing. So this is a really active part, but when we finally have an idea that's viable that we think we can go forward with, we actually start to plan. And when we start the planning, we actually have to start thinking a little bit more about how do we help teachers get the materials into their schools and classes. So for every one of our units, we have a series of science learning objectives that we'd like them to, that we hope the unit helps them to teach around science. So these are the ones that would go with the unit on astronomy that the kids would be learning in science. We're going to be reinforcing these science concepts, and we're going to actually measure to figure out whether or not we're doing this as part of it. We also have to identify a set of engineering learning objectives, and so these are the things that we have decided that we're going to try to teach this unit, and again, we had to measure all of these. Once it got onto this list, it had to be measured when we went to do testing. So as we were planning this curriculum, we actually had to work initially on two levels. We were working on an individual unit level, but then we were also trying to figure out what does the larger curriculum look like. And so it actually took something like 9 different revisions before we got to a standard set of lessons, probably about 5 years into the program. So there was a lot of rewriting, because every time you make a design decision, all the previous units had to be rewritten. But we ultimately settled on a 4-unit structure. There's actually a little pre-activity the kids do if they haven't done any engineering before that helps them understand or construct a definition of engineering and technology. The first lesson, they always read a storybook. The second lesson we designed to help give them a broader view of what engineers do, because what we were finding in our research is that kids were saying things like, I don't want to be an agricultural engineer, I don't want to move to the Dominican Republic, which is where that book was set, and I'm not interested in creating hand pollinators. So we figured out we were starting to actually introduce misconceptions about engineering that we didn't feel were the best way to approach. So we have one lesson that isn't set in any particular context, that steps back from the design challenge that will be the primary focus and helps them get a broader view of the kinds of work that agricultural engineers might do. So in this case, in this unit, they actually look a little bit, they have Farmer Jane and Farmer Bob, and they have an orchard, and there's a little play that the kids do that goes through the orchard in different seasons and talks about the pests that are eating the apples and how they use integrated pest management to solve that problem like agricultural engineers. So we even have a little song, which I will not sing. But they're kind of playful, they're fun, and they give the kids a slightly broader view. And then they move into lessons 3 and 4. In lesson 3, they're actually doing some controlled scientific testing so they can become smarter about the properties of the materials they're using. In the real world, we don't have any engineers start to design a bridge that's a $60 million bridge that doesn't have any background. So our challenge was, what does background look like for 6-year-olds? So we figured if we could at least give them some sort of experiences with the materials, the properties, the kinds of science they should be drawing on, they'll walk into lesson 4, and it won't just be, I'm picking the pom-pom because it's pink, which is what we were seeing before we instituted lesson 3. So now there's a set of data you've collected. Theoretically, your decision should be based in those, that set of data. It doesn't always happen like that, but it's a good chart to bring back when they get a little diverted by color, or they also like really shiny metal things. The elementary level, shiny is very cool. So that after we sort of planned out the unit, it was time to start creating this, and this was again a whole series of rapid cycle testing back and forth, but we created ultimately a number of products. We have a set of teacher lesson plans that sort of can walk the teachers through what does this look like, and particularly what kinds of questions would you ask, because it's very open-ended, so you'll notice you can't read them, but in the bold are the kinds of questions the teachers might be asking their student. And of course, they want us to write the answers. We don't have any answers, it's open-ended, so that was a little bit of a back and forth with the teachers. We create a whole set of student worksheets that the students can use, and we do this at 2 levels. We do what we call a set for the basic kids, or kids who are 6 or 7 years old, and then we do a set for advanced kids, kids who may be more like ages 8 through 11. We don't put the ages on there because if you have a group of students who's struggling at the older grades or don't read English well, you can use the basic version. So we wrote all these. We had to design a whole set of assessments because, again, everything has to be data-driven. So if we say we're going to have these as our learning objectives, we need to figure out if this is actually working, because if we're going to scale, we need to convince large districts that this is actually accomplishing something. So this was quite an endeavor that we're still engaged with. How do you measure engineering in ways that make sense and align with the kinds of goals that you're doing? Teachers don't know anything about engineering. They've never had a class in engineering. You might get them if you're lucky for 6 hours of professional development, maybe, if you're very lucky. So we had to try to help them think about ways they can get smarter about what engineering is. And so they asked us for background, but only 3/4 of a page. Anything more than that, they didn't want to read. So our units have some background both about the technology and about the field of engineering, and we're actually starting to build a very big resource base online of different kinds of ways that teachers can continue to get professional development. We also do professional development, so we do, I'd say, over probably between 200 and 300 workshops a year for teachers to help them actually have an experience and model some of the ways that we believe pedagogy should happen. As I mentioned, one of the active things we're doing right now is trying to create a whole variety of online resources that either teachers who are using our materials, or if teachers aren't using our materials but still want to get a sense of what elementary engineering looks like, they can go on and take a look at anything from extensions into literacy or mathematics to a whole library of over 800 videos of kids doing engineering in classrooms. So the development process was quite an event. For one unit, which is about 8 to 10 hours of classroom time, it took us about 3,000 hours of development. It was a full 2.5 years. By the time we released those units, we knew they would work pretty much anywhere with any teachers. Because every teacher we got feedback or observed in his or her classroom to make sure that it was meeting our needs. We worked with about, as I said, we worked with about 15 teachers originally in a very close interaction with them. We actually went and watched the lessons with those set of teachers, both at a younger grade level and an older grade level, and took notes and had the kids work on the assessments. And then once we did a huge revision, it went out for national testing across the country, where we also got oodles of data to make sure that we were doing what we thought we were. And then theoretically it was done, but in reality, it usually was 2 or 3 more cycles of that before it could go out. So that kicks us to improve. So all these data we're collecting, we're trying to do this with a goal of improving the curriculum. And this goes on today. We still very much see the units that we have right now as our best first draft, but we constantly are learning more as we're out in classrooms and doing more research about how to do this better. So we have a huge set of ideas already for what we'll do the next time around. But as we collected data out in the field, even while we were doing this, we asked the kinds of questions like these. What's working? More importantly, what's not working? Who's it working for? Are there certain populations that are more engaged or less engaged? Are we meeting the objectives that we set out? And if we weren't, then one of 2 things happened. Either the learning objective was changed, or the curriculum was changed so that we met the learning objective. But every assessment that we have and every learning objective we have has all been mapped to make sure that we can have some sort of evidence to show that we actually have student-based data that shows that something's happening in their classrooms. So when we were working in the classrooms on the first draft, doing our testing, there were 3 kinds of things that we looked at. We looked at the actual materials themselves and asked teachers to give us some feedback about were they easy to use and were they valuable, are you going to use them again? And what we have found actually from an external evaluator recently is that 95% of our teachers use the materials in year 2, 75% in year 5, 65% in year 8, and 45% in year 10. So there's a staying power once they get over that activation energy to get it into the classroom, they work. And I believe that is, again, because we work so closely with teachers as we were developing them to make sure it was what they needed. We looked a lot at student learning. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then we talked a lot about student attitudes toward engineering, toward STEM. These aren't necessarily predictive, but a lot of our funders are industry people, and they all love to hear about how these little kids are all going to grow up and become the next generation of engineers. They keep saying they're 6 years old. We can't promise you anything, but it's good to collect some data, and that way you can at least measure at the time when they're high off in engineering that they don't hate it. So as we were doing our curriculum development, these are the kinds of numbers that we looked at with our units. We had we interviewed about 250 kids. We did about 500 classroom observations of units. That would be from beginning to end. We collected 1,300 teacher feedback forms and 13,000 student assessments. So we had a lot of data. And these are kind of fun to go through, especially when they're open-ended. So we asked one question: do you think that the work you did for this activity is engineering? Why or why not? And they didn't really answer the question, but they agreed because it was the most awesome thing ever. So there must be some relationship between engineering and being awesome. Then, as I said, the kind of research, we have lots and lots of thousands and thousands of pages of research that we've done or other people have done. It's all on our website, but I'm going to give you sort of the 3 big highlights of what we've learned, or what our studies are showing us so far. So we found that students who use our curriculum perform significantly better than a set of control students who are just studying the science on questions about engineering and technology. That's good, the other group didn't get it. But also, interestingly enough, they're doing significantly better on their science. But we didn't write the curriculum with this in mind. It makes sense that if you're using science and applying it, it will stick a little longer. But this was really interesting to us. So here at the bottom we see, again, it's a bubble scan, but they can't help but write stuff, which of course our scanners really hate. But this was actually on the engineering interest and attitudes, and this little kid writes, last summer I thought engineers only made electronics. Now I think that engineers design stuff to solve a problem. So unbidden by us, they're making sure that we understand that they know what engineers do. It had to change. So I mentioned our first thing was to draw an engineer test. We knew there were all kinds of problems with that instrument. We were just trying to get our toe dipped in the water. So that's evolved quite a bit over time. Our second version, we decided we would show kids pictures because we didn't know, are they not choosing it or not depicting it because they genuinely don't know engineers do that, or are they not doing it because we just asked them to do one thing. So we made a series of little icons and thought of things, some things which engineers do and some things which engineers do not do with their work. That involved even more because that's great, but that is really hard to hand scan when you've got 10,000 of these babies coming in. So our most recent version that we're using in a very, very large efficacy study is a bubble scan where they either choose yes or no about what the kind of work that engineers would do for their job and which kind of activities are important for the work of an engineer. And once again, we have kids who are so excited that they have to go way outside the box. So here, how important are to the following activities for the work of an engineer? Using their creativity, we have 1 million, and brainstorming different ideas is Google triple. So they can't wait to tell you. And so we have a lot of these that are supposed to feed to the scanner that we actually can't enter. We're assuming that we can put very important and not mess up our stats for that one. So we've given this what is engineering both to kids before and after they've used our materials, but also we benchmarked it against what do real live engineers who are working in the field do. And what we see is that there is a change in students' ideas of what engineers do that's statistically significant from before they do the engineering to after, but they still have a ways to go until they mirror the kinds of findings that the green bars, the engineers in the, who are practicing actually tell us. We have a similar survey we've done for technology, so we give kids various items that we think are technology, shoes, brooms, windmills, and ask them, is it a technology, yes or no? And what we find from here is that the kids on the pre-assessment, the blue bars, are much more likely to associate technology as anything that has electricity. This includes lightning, by the way. Lightning's fascinating. We put it in there every time because they choose it because it has electricity. So lightning is a technology, according to most kids. So in the pre-post we see a lot of, or the pre-test we see a lot of electricity. On the post-test, that goes down dramatically. You'll see with the red bars. And you'll see that they start to think a lot more about the two sort of defining attributes that we're hoping they get to, that technologies are human-made and they solve a problem. When you look at the actual technology, if you break them down by whether something is naturally occurring in nature, sort of a simple technology like a broom or a basket, something that has a mechanical feature to it, like a bicycle or a wind-up toy, and whether it has electrical, this is the percentage correct. So they generally, on the pre and the post test, both know that natural things are not technology, and that electrical things are technology, but the interesting ones are the ones in between, where at the beginning they really don't understand that there are many things in the world around them that do not have electricity or power, like roller skates or bicycles or baskets that are in fact a technology that had to be designed by an engineer. A second major finding that I mentioned that we're looking at is sort of looking at students' attitudes toward engineering, and we expand this to be toward science as well. So we also find that kids who use EIE are more likely than students who are just doing science to say they're interested in engineering as a career. Again, they've been exposed, so this isn't rocket science. This is what we're hoping they say. But what's interesting, when you look at the attitudes test, which we based on a previous instrument that was focused on science, is the kind of things you learn from the questions. And so we find that kids are more likely to have improved attitudes toward thinking about engineering as a career, or agree with the statement that they know what engineers do for their job. So regardless of whether or not they're personally planning to go into engineering, it's good that they at least have an awareness of what these folks do out in the world. So here's another classroom. It's the same classroom we saw Marcus, who talked about being an engineer out in the world. Here's the same classroom wrapping up that lesson, and you'll see the kinds of stuff that the teacher says that gets the kids really thinking about engineering as a career they might pursue.
Who can be an engineer?
Anyone.
Anyone, okay? And I hope that everybody realizes that, all right?
Yeah, children.
Even children. So not just adults, but even children. Now, of course, if you're an engineer as an adult, guess what?
You know more.
Well, you will, but you'll still be an engineer. Because you can actually do it as a job. You can be an engineer as a career. You can go to college, learn more about the field, and then eventually you can spend every single day, for example, being a materials engineer, working with a bunch of materials, figuring out how they go together, making new materials from existing materials, okay? It is a wealth of opportunities for people who are interested in engineering.
Good to do. What we also did when we run all of our instruments, we break it out by all of the various demographic groups, and one thing we always look at is gender. So we find from our list of various items that boys in general are more interested in inventing and figuring things out than girls. They'll report that. And girls come back to this idea that they're much more interested and intrigued by things that help people and or the environment. And here we have another student from that class who says it in her own words.
When I grow up, I would like to be an engineer because I've been wanting to make things that would be helpful. And when I grow up, I think I can make things that would be helpful for people.
So that resonates back to that design principle of helping them to make those connections that engineers do helpful things. They don't only make bombs. There's ways that they can build a society around this. So the last of the research results, we've done quite a bit of work, and we're still working quite heavily on looking at this idea of underrepresented groups and how they perform. So we had an outside researcher look for us and have some teacher reported data. We're currently working on the student data that reports that students from underrepresented groups that we're looking at show increased interest, engagement, and performance when they're using the EIE materials as opposed to when they're doing science or just school in general. So those are really promising results. So we're currently engaged in a huge study that's looking at a couple things. It's looking at the fidelity of implementation, because we have all these data from pilot testers, but we know they did not necessarily do what was exactly in the curriculum. So we're trying to get a sense of what do teachers do. So we have hundreds of hours of people wearing lanyards around their necks and audio recording, so we can actually get a sense of what they say and which lessons they do. And we're also, the primary point of it though, is really to look at these critical components, the design components for inclusivity. Let's see if we can actually test and see if student outcomes are better in a curriculum that has these, that would be EIE, as opposed to a curriculum that does not have these. Since there was no other curriculum, we actually had to design our own control curriculum that has all the same learning objectives, all the same science content, all the same engineering content, but without those critical components. So for instance, instead of an illustrated storybook, the kids do a factual reading on what does a mechanical engineer do. They're not allowed to go back and improve. They just do the challenge, and if it doesn't work, too bad, it's on to the next thing. So we just finished collecting the data. We have about 200,000 pieces of data over the last 2 years that we will start to analyze. We actually have just started to analyze, and the data are looking very, very promising for being able to say, through large statistical models, that actually, if you include these design components, you have better outcomes for students on interests or